Then a woman said, "Speak to us of joy and sorrow." And he answered, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the selfsame well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. How else can it be? The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed out with knives? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. And when you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say, joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. Only when you are empty are you at a standstill and balanced. When the treasure keeper lifts you to weigh his gold and his silver, must your joy or your sorrow rise or fall? Which brings me into our sermon today, which is on joy and sorrow. So, talking about joy and sorrow is a loaded endeavor these days. Just how everybody thinks that you need a perfectly organized house, so too people en masse have decided that we all need to be happy all of the time. It seems that there's a right way to feel, and a lot of platitudes and advice for those who aren't stepping in line. I'm here to tell you that there is more than one way to think about joy and sorrow. Today we're going to look at 3 of them. That doesn't mean there's only 3, but those are the 3 I felt like talking about. So I'll give my own opinions on each, and you are free to consider yours. The 3 modes of thinking that we will consider today are outcomes-based thinking, process-based thinking, and thinking about joy and sorrow as the integration of a duality. So first, what is outcomes-based thinking? We're all familiar with this on some level. It's looking at things in terms of the end result, but it can be somewhat binary. An example might be, joy, I feel good, joy is good. Or, sorrow, I feel bad, sorrow is bad. A number of things can be thought about in this way. Good outcome, this was good. Bad outcome, this was bad. You failed the test or you passed the test. Your home, room, appearance looks neat and tidy or it doesn't. You are a good student, teacher, parent, child, spouse, or you aren't. Generally here, what is valued is the outcome. There's little room for nuance or missing the mark, and the process is generally irrelevant. Sometimes this thinking can be valuable. My house is any amount flooded. This is bad. Lesson learned. I have a problem. I should go fix it to get a better outcome. There are a few problems that this sort of thinking can give rise to, though. Sometimes this thinking can lead us astray. How about, I cheated and passed the test. Outcome, passed the test. Lesson learned, cheating is good. But is cheating good? If you don't think so, then clearly we need another way to look at things other than only outcomes-based thinking. Additionally, when we look at joy and sorrow, outcomes-based thinking ignores that sorrow is every bit as much a part of being alive as joy. And to simplify such a profound and life-altering emotion to a binary value system detracts from the role it can play as a catalyst or a milestone in our lives. If, as Khalil Gibran says, you have been burned in the potter's oven or hollowed out with knives, then your sorrow has been hard won, and you shouldn't have to apologize for the fact that it makes other people uncomfortable to gaze upon sorrow. The other problem I see with looking at joy and sorrow as an outcome is that if you accept either one as an outcome, then life becomes stagnant and unchanging once the outcome is reached. This might look like, somebody get me my harp. I'm going to be over here being joyful till the end of time, and I'm done with sorrow from now on. Or, I will never feel joy again because what happened to me was so terrible that I can never move past it. Both of these signal that you are stuck in one place as life moves on around you. Enter process-based thinking. So process-based thinking looks at joy and sorrow in terms of mechanisms of change. There's room to evaluate the process, room for troubleshooting, room for nuance. One benefit of this model is that it isn't stagnant. It doesn't accept that if something is one way or the other way now, that it will always be that way. This way looks at the contrast of opposites. So this might look this way. If I'm feeling sorrow, by what process can I feel joy? If I am joyful, by what process can I feel sorrow? According to some theories of psychology, there are two answers to this. But first I need to explain a concept called real versus manufactured emotions. So this is actually a concept from a therapy called cognitive processing therapy, which is used for PTSD. And they teach this as an example of ways that people can become stuck in emotions. So they distinguish between real emotions and manufactured emotions. So real emotions. Think back to your wedding, the day you got your first car, graduating, getting your first paycheck, etc. Now think back to paying the bills for the wedding, the time your car was ruined by a hailstorm, failing a test, realizing what your student loan payment amount would be each month. Are you still joyful or sorrowful about these things now? Probably not, unless they happened quite recently. The peak emotion might have lasted for a few minutes, a day, hours, a week, and then you moved on with your life and you probably are joyful or sorrowful about different things now. According to cognitive processing therapy, this is the natural trajectory of emotions, that they are transient. And then they contrast this with manufactured emotions. In this model, something happens that is good or bad, or maybe not good or bad, and you have a thought about that. And each time that you have that thought, it creates the same emotion fresh all over again. And the end result is that you have that emotion with the same intensity throughout time. Here's an example of a real emotion. I spilled milk. Sad I have to clean the milk. Milk is clean. Move on. Here's how that same thing might go as a manufactured emotion. Spilled milk. Have a thought. No one gives me any respect and my family members keep leaving milk everywhere, even though I ask them not to. No one gives me any consideration. Angry about the meaning and story that we have given to the spilled milk, and then we continue to be angry about the spilled milk, even though the milk itself was a rather benign and ordinary event. That's what manufactured emotions might look like. So now that we have these definitions out of the way, what does process-based thinking look like? So it can look a few different ways. One way that it can look like is starting with joy. There's a loss, and that loss leads to sorrow. Starting with sorrow, there's a hope, and that hope leads to joy. That would be kind of the real emotion trajectory. In terms of manufactured emotions, you might have, starting with joy, there's a loss, you tell yourself something devastating about that loss, and that loss is always fresh. Or, starting with sorrow, there is hope, you tell yourself a delusional lie about how hopeful things actually are, and you feel joy even though everything is crashing down upon you because you are forcing it. That would be the manufactured emotions, kind of process-based thinking surrounding joy and sorrow. This model gives one an idea of what to do if you don't like the way you're feeling now. There's a process to change. You can work the steps and move on. Or maybe you look at this process-based thinking and you think a totally different thing entirely. For example, I read a book in college by Epictetus, who is a philosopher for ideas that belong to a branch of philosophy called nihilism. If I were to think about how Epictetus might look at process-based thinking with regard to joy and sorrow, based on my reading of what he wrote, he might look at these processes and say, exactly, here is the problem. All this moving between joy and sorrow is totally exhausting. I just want to be neutral and calm all the time. In this case, he might come up with a different mechanism that looks like this. Don't value anything, never have anything worth losing, and never feel sorrow. Or the corollary. Don't value anything, never hope for anything, and never feel joy. Process-based thinking might be your jam if you're all about mechanisms and how things work. But I think that there's a third way that appeals more deeply to the way that I understand the world. This is integration of opposites into a cohesive whole. So, for example, in our opening statement, Edmund Burke compared the joys and sorrows, the pleasures and pain, the hopes and fears of humanity to the sweetest flowers and the sharpest thorns. I believe he was saying that these things belong together, that they make up components of a whole life, that the whole life has joy and sorrow, hopes and fears, pleasure and pain. Just as you would not remove one tire from your car, so too a life that is devoid of one of these aspects is incomplete. Waves of the ocean ebb and flow. If they only ebbed or only flowed, it would go against the nature and order of things. Likewise, when Khalil Gibran says, "When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy." Or, when you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. The idea that you can't have one without the other, that they are inseparable, that together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember the other is asleep upon your bed. And then also, another example, the reading for all today was by Christopher Alexander. He was an architect, and he spent a great deal of time and energy writing his philosophies about how to make architectural structures come to life and have the properties of nature. He postulated that when we migrate to an area of a home, that we like that area, use that area, continually repeat returning to that area in order to do things, that it must have properties which he calls, because he tried on a lot of terms from the English language and decided they were all not effective, the quality without a name, which imbues it with life. In Our Story for All Ages, he wrote, "To make a thing which has the character of nature requires that we become aware that all of it is transitory, that all of it is going to pass. When we see a frog hopping on the ground, we know it's alive, and we know that one day it's going to be dead. When we see a frog dead on the ground, we know that it was once alive." This is the synthesis of the duality of life, that a frog can bring both joy and sorrow, that frogs will live and die. Just as a frozen wave would seem eerie and unnatural, so too recognize that whenever joy and sorrow, wherever they stand in your life, that they are not complete and natural alone. And just as you respect the thorns of a rose when you grasp it, there should be respect for the nature of a life and for the seasons of that life, of which joy and sorrow are only two aspects. So, closing words today. I tell you not to go and be joyful and not to go and be sorrowful, but to go knowing that wherever you stand today with regard to your joy and sorrow, that you are alive and that joy and sorrow are inseparable from life. And now I will turn it back over for the closing hymn, number 327.